Folks, I'm sitting here on my old wooden porch as the sun's just starting to dip behind the pines, and I can't shake a memory that's been weighing on me since last night. It sneaks up on me like fog rolling in off the holler, that smell of damp earth and crushed hemlock needles mixed with the ache of a man who's carried more secrets than stones in his pockets. I've got this old enamel mug of chamomile tea warming my hands, and every sip taste of long afternoons when my mama's gentle lullabies floated through the kitchen. Sometimes I close my eyes and can almost taste the daylily she planted by the garden gate, feel her soft humming woven into that Appalachian breeze. I guess you might be wondering who I am. I'm just a man in my mid-60s, been around the block near 70 Springs, with more winters under my belt than I care to count. Tonight, though, something stirred in the quiet. Maybe it was the old cuckoo clock in the hall that ticked off in perfect time with my breath. Or maybe it was the soft sigh of the wind that whispered through these Appalachian ridges. Whatever it was, it took me right back to a barn in East Tennessee back in '59, where my young self learned that fear could fill up a room thicker than hay. I don't share this lightly, friends. There's a weight to words like these, a heaviness that settles in your chest like cold ashes. But I feel it's time to lay it out plain, because memories like that don't just fade, they turn over in the dark and bite at your sleep until you reckon with them. If you're the kind that believes in reckoning, well, I'd be obliged if you'd tap that like button or leave a comment down below. Tell me you're hearing me, because it makes a body feel less alone. And if you're thinking about sticking around for more, you might consider sitting a spell and subscribing, so you won't miss what comes next. Now, let me tell you why that barn has haunted me all these years. When I was 10, just a young'un, my pa, a Korean War vet with hands as rough as river stones, decided that I needed to learn obedience the hard way. That night, in the pitch black of that ramshackle barn, I tasted fear in every splinter of wood and each rattling breeze that slipped through board cracks. A chain was fastened tight around my ankle, anchored to a timber beam that sagged over my head like a judge with no mercy. The cold metal bit into me, and the barn smelled of rain-soaked straw, of old secrets, and of a boy's silent prayers. The sky outside was a dark bruise, and I figured I'd never see daylight again. I remember thinking that if I did, it'd be pure miracle. That memory stays with me because it wasn't just about pain, it was about learning to notice the tiniest glimmer of hope, like water dripping down from a leaky roof, reminding me that even when you're chained, the world still has a soft spot for you. That's what I carry with me every time the wind rustles these pines and calls my name. And that's why I can't rest easy until I share it with you. I reckon if you've got even an inkling of what I'm talking about, you'll want to hear what happened next. So lean in close, because the truth ain't easy to tell, but it's one I've carried every day since. But that's only the beginning of a tale. When I was a boy growing up in East Tennessee, our little cabin sat tucked between the whispering pines and a creek that never quit singing its song. And I can still see Mama's faded gingham curtains fluttering in the morning breeze as the sun painted dewdrops on the grass. Back then, Sunday meant church at the white clapboard meeting house down the dirt road, and the whole holler smelled of fresh biscuits, strong black coffee, and the hope that God would look kindly on a humble family. My pa worked the fields from sunrise to sunset, his hands worn like river stones, while Mama tended the garden, humming hymns as she coaxed tomatoes and beans out of stubborn Appalachian soil. I was the middle child, tall for my age but with a heartbeat full of wonder. I thought kindness was the currency of this world, that a gentle word and a steady hand could mend any hurt. I remember chasing fireflies at dusk with my little sister clinging to my hand, her giggles drifting over the tall grass like a promise that tomorrow would be better than today. Sometimes, I'd climb up on the rusted tractor tire and stare at the rolling hills beyond our farm, convinced that people always found their way back home, no matter how far they roamed. Sometimes, a simple kindness can light up the darkest holler, I'd whisper to myself, believing every drop of mercy counted in a place where life was as rugged as the limestone rocks underfoot. My world was small but full, the cadence of Pa's whistle in the fields, the soft lullaby of the creek at night, the chorus of cicadas droning a lullaby under a harvest moon. I learned early that a nod and a morning neighbor could open doors, that lending a hand to the widow Jenkins or trading a jar of Mama's blackberry jam with old Mr. Carter meant more than coins in a pocket. I dreamed of setting out beyond those mountains, maybe to Nashville where music spilled out of every tavern, or even farther to see oceans and cities that sparkled under neon lights. But more than anything, I dreamed of a world where a man's word held weight, where you could trust a stranger's smile. In the evenings, Pa would sit on the front porch with his chair tilted back, pipe in hand, and tell stories of his own daddy, tales of hunting wild turkeys and felling trees twice his height. I'd lean forward, captivated, as the crickets chorused in agreement, believing that strength came from endurance and that anyone could overcome hardship with a steady heart. Mama would pour us lemonade from a scratched pitcher, and the sun would hang in the sky like a promise unspent. Those were the days when laughter was wide as the Tennessee sky and sorrow felt like a distant rumor. I carried that hope in my pockets like silver nuggets, convinced that goodness would always come around. And even when the wind turned cold and the pines creaked with warning, I held tight to my dreams, thinking that kindness was the truest path to freedom. Looking back now, I see how those simple rhythms, prayer before meals, the scent of honeysuckle on a summer night, the soft echo of hymns in a wooden church, shaped the man I became. I can still taste the sweet cake Mama baked for potluck dinners, feel the warmth of community as we gathered round rough-hewn tables, trading stories and offering solace. I was just a young un with stars in my eyes, believing that the world was kinder than cruel, that a good deed planted itself in the heart and sprouted hope. And that, friends, is where the story begins, when a boy learned that love could grow in the smallest of places, and that sometimes you had to believe in people before they believed in themselves. I remember the day my pa came home from Korea like it was branded into my mind. The whole hollow felt the tremor of that old Chevy rolling up the dirt road, engine chugging, clouds of dust rising like ghosts. Mama was out on the porch, wrinkled smile on her face and arms wide, but when the door swung open, Pa stepped into the sunlight with eyes as empty as a winter sky. He carried that duffel bag like it was full of thunder, and every step he took sounded like footsteps in a dream. My sister and I froze, and my brother, just 17 then, leaned back against the railing, jaw tight, waiting to see if this man with medals on his chest was still our father or a stranger in his place. I felt my heart pound so hard it nearly knocked the wind right out of me. I couldn't explain why the sight of him made me feel both proud and terrified all at once. He nodded at Mama, voice low and gravel rough. "I'm home," but the words landed like stones in a pond. No ripples, no welcome. That afternoon, Pa walked me through the fields, pointed to the rows of corn and beans, and tried to teach me how to plow with the horses. But every time I looked up, I saw shadows dance behind his eyes, and I knew this man carried more than the weight of an army on his shoulders. A week later, old Miss Clara down the lane brought over a handwritten letter from a state sergeant, all polite regret and chest-thumping pride. I watched as Mama's fingers trembled reading it, the ink blurring where tears fell. It spoke of lost friends, nameless battles, of boys' broken boots. I saw Pa's jaw clench, saw the way his hands curled into fists. That letter changed everything. Suddenly, our cabin felt smaller, darker, as if the walls were closing in. Mom tried to fill the silence with supper chatter, talk of Sunday service, gossip about Mr. Carter's hog, but Pa just sat there, staring at his plate, untouched. My brother slammed down his fork, cussing under his breath in that way that made me flinch. And I walked out to the barn, heart hammering, thinking maybe the horses would talk back if I whispered to them. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard Pa's boots scrape across the floor, heard the low hum of his voice as he talked to Mama through closed doors. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to catch every word, but all I heard was the wind rattling the window panes. The next morning, Pa wasn't the man I'd known. He barked orders over breakfast, called me a good-for-nothing when I spilled milk. I felt my throat tighten, confusion and fear twisting together. I wanted to run out to the creek, splash cold water on my face, tell myself it was just a bad dream, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed, hands trembling on the table, watching the man who was supposed to protect me become someone I barely recognized. And then there was the day I glimpsed a scrap of something in Pa's pocket, a battered photograph of a young soldier laughing with buddies under a sky too blue to be real. I snatched it, felt shame and curiosity fight in my chest. In that moment, I knew he wasn't a hero come home. He was a wounded boy trapped in a man's body. My head spun with questions I couldn't ask, with feelings too big for my 10-year-old heart. That was the day I first understood how damage travels, how what happens on distant hills can echo back to a child's bedroom. It set me on a path I couldn't turn from, the path that led me right into the barn where I'd learn what fear truly meant. But before the chains in the rainwater, there was this, a boy meeting the man his father had become, and realizing that some returns leave deeper scars than any war can heal. I remember the weeks after that letter arrived feeling like the sun had slipped behind a dark cloud that never moved. Suddenly, mornings weren't filled with the chirp of sparrows or the warm scent of Mama's coffee. They were punctuated by the clank of Pa's heavy boots on the front porch and the acrid stench of whiskey lingering on his breath. One afternoon, he came home earlier than usual, his eyes harder than river stones, and ordered me into the barn to fetch his work gloves. I opened the door, and the air inside was thick with hay dust and the tang of old leather, and I froze when I heard him holler my name like a rifle shot in the stillness. I'd been 10 for only a month, but in that moment I felt small as a twig. I crept in, ready to hand over the gloves, but he slammed the door so hard the hinges rattled. "Move faster," he barked, voice low and dangerous. My hand shook as I picked up the gloves, and I saw him standing in the doorway, silhouette framed by the dying light, a shadow with the shape of my father but none of his warmth. Those were the first real hints that my world was shifting, like the ground beneath me had gone rotten. Outside, the neighbor kids still played tag in the yard, their laughter echoing across the fence, but inside, I tasted fear like bitter medicine. After that day, chores grew heavier and more precise, mending fence posts until the sun sank, hauling buckets of water under his watchful eye, each drip from the well feeling like a countdown to something I couldn't name. At supper, he'd sit silent, gaze fixed on the wood grain of the table, while Mama spooned mashed potatoes onto our plates, her lips pressed into a thin line. I wanted to ask her what to do, but the words would trap in my throat. I could feel her guilt like a weight on my shoulders, and I feared troubling her more than angering Pa. My brother had already left for the road, hunting work wherever he could find it, and my sister hid behind the curtains, her eyes watching me with that old sorrow I'd hardly recognized until then. The whole farm felt like a stage, and I was the only one without lines. One morning, as I led the mule down the lane to fetch hay, I heard Pa shouting at Mama through the screen door, something about good-for-nothings and God's wrath, and I felt a hot anger rise in my chest so fierce I nearly dropped the reins. But the mule tugged free, and I stumbled after her, heart pounding, afraid that if I stayed, I'd burst into tears or stand up to him and risk God knows what. That day, I understood shame in a new way, not the embarrassed kind, but a hollow ache that told me I didn't belong anywhere. At night, I lay in my straw mattress, blankets thin and scratchy, listening to the wind wheel through the gaps in the walls, and I'd whisper to myself that this wasn't right. But every morning, the chores still waited, stacking firewood until my arms burned, brushing down the horses until my palms stung, scrubbing the kitchen floor until my knees ached. Father never praised a single bit of work. Instead, he'd flick his cigarette ash in the garden and glare at me like I'd done something unforgivable. I started to keep my voice low, to learn the exact pitch that wouldn't stir his temper, and I'd swallow my questions whole, pouching them inside me until they hurt. There were moments when I wondered if I'd ever be free of that tension, if home would always taste like bitter tea and hollow silences. Sometimes, Mama would slip outside at dusk and slip her hand into mine, whispering that she was sorry, that she loved me, but even her soft words couldn't undo the tremor in my voice with a knot in my gut. By then, I'd begun to carry a small stone in my pocket, a smooth river pebble I'd found by the creek, just to remind myself that there was still something solid in the world. It was a tension I couldn't escape, a storm cloud gathering on the horizon of my childhood, and I could feel the electricity in the air, like the moment just before a summer squall, knowing that something was about to break. I remember the day my world truly stopped in its tracks, like that old cuckoo clock froze mid-chime and the wind held its breath just to watch. It was the third night I'd been locked in that barn, the one on the far edge of our property where the hay hung heavy and the shadows dripped off the rafters like dark honey. I'd lost track of time. Days and nights blurred together with nothing but the drip of rainwater to mark their passing, but I felt it in my bones when Pa's silhouette filled the doorway, lantern swinging, eyes burning brighter than any star. "Thought you'd learned your place, didn't you?" he growled, voice low and cracked like old leather. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just afraid of the dark. I was afraid of the man who'd made it my prison. My heart thundered so loud I half believed the whole barn would shake apart, and I saw every memory of my childhood flash before me. Mama's lullabies, my sister's laughter, the soft murmur of the creek. And right then, I knew I had a choice: be broken like the boards overhead or fight for a sliver of hope. Pa stepped closer, boots crunching on straw, and I could taste the cold metal of the chain mounting fresh fear in my veins. He lifted his hand, like he might strike me, but the lantern swung, and for a second I saw something behind his anger, a fractured man who'd traded tenderness for terror. But I couldn't pity him. Pity wouldn't set me free. I braced myself against the beam, muscles trembling, and I hissed, "You don't own me." The words felt strange, laced with a courage I didn't know I had. Pa froze, his fist halfway to my face, and I swear time stopped right then. The rain outside drummed a slow tattoo on the roof, and in the hush I heard my own breath, ragged but alive. That was the moment I shed my fear like an old coat and decided I'd rather taste the cold night air than swallow another ounce of his wrath. With all the strength my 10-year-old body could muster, I jerked my ankle against the chain's rotten wood anchor. It groaned and cracked, the sound slicing through the silence like a blade. And in that split second the beam snapped, sending splinters flying. I stumbled, heart slamming against my ribs, but I was free. I didn't wait to see Pa's reaction. I burst through the chicken wire window, the rain lashing my face, and I ran. I remember the wet ground spitting up mud beneath my bare feet, the barn's warmth replaced by the night's sharp chill, and for the first time in days, I felt alive. But freedom came with a price. As I fled toward the house, I heard Pa's roar behind me, a sound that shook the old oaks. I realized then I was leaving more than a barn behind. I was leaving the boy who believed love lived in those walls. I discovered that running from pain didn't erase it. It only planted its seeds in your heart. Yet in that race through the dark, I also found something precious, the unbreakable spark of hope. I carried it with me all the way to the church on the hill, where a kindly pastor wrapped me in a quilt and whispered that God had guided my steps. In that instant, I lost my innocence, but I gained a conviction I'd carry for life, that no chain, no matter how cold or heavy, can bind a soul determined to live. That barn might still stand in East Tennessee, a silent witness to my darkest hour, but I am no longer the boy who trembled in its shadows. I am the man who broke free, who learned that sometimes the only way out is through the fear, and that even in the deepest night, you can find the edge of dawn. I walked away from that barn under a sky smeared with moonlight and never felt the same again. The days that followed were a quiet haze, like breathing through a straw, each inhale thin and uncertain. I found myself waking before dawn, the world outside still wrapped in its midnight coat, and for a long time I didn't know if I was alive or simply a memory wandering between wakes. Sometimes I'd sit on the edge of my bed in that church basement rescue home, hands folded in my lap, and wonder if the boy I once was had slipped through my fingers when I slipped out of that window. The pastor's quote kept me warm, but it couldn't stitch the ache in my chest. My faith in people, in kindness, slipped like water through a clenched fist. A man I once trusted held me prisoner. I'd whisper into the stillness, "So how do I know I can trust the sunrise?" There were mornings when I watched the sun climb behind the hills and felt no hope in its glow, only the echo of my own ragged breath. Friends I made at the shelter, some boys without a home, others like me patched together by loss, tried to laugh and break the silence, but I stuttered out conversations, afraid my voice would betray the tremor I carried inside. I learned to speak softly, to fill my words with only what was necessary, because silence felt safer than risk. For months, I wandered the church's worn halls like a ghost, sliding into pews for services I didn't heed and slipping out before the final hymn. I prayed, once, for my past forgiveness, but the words caught in my throat, tangled in shame and bitterness. Instead, I prayed for strength to keep moving, to make sense of a world that had shown me both cruelty and mercy in the same breath. The seasons changed, and I saw my reflection in the creek. The wide-eyed boy who once believed that kindness could mend all wounds had been replaced by a gaze that searched for shadows before seeing light. I carried a small piece of that barn's rusty chain in my pocket, the jagged sliver of metal that reminded me of the weight I'd shed and the burden I still dragged along. Some days, that cold fragment felt like a promise that I was stronger than the fear, and other days it felt like a shackle I couldn't shake. I lost friends, 2 boys who found families or families that turned them away. I buried them in my heart and let their stories become mine, a solemn chorus that sang of lives interrupted. At night, I'd lie awake listening to crickets whisper their lullabies, and I'd think of my sister's silent eyes, wondering if she carried the same hollow ache. I tried to write letters, one to Mama, one to the pastor, even one foolish, trembling note to Pa. But each page I drafted I'd crumple and drop into the fire pit behind the chapel, believing that some words were too heavy to send into the world. Slowly, though, something shifted. A neighbor named Mr. Carter, whose barn I once helped mend, offered me work fixing wire fences and feeding his cattle. He spoke little but smiled more than most, and one evening he laid a hand on my shoulder and said, "Boy, pain's a storm you weather, but it don't have to wash you away." That simple truth settled inside me like a seed. I began to see that life after trauma wasn't a straight road back to who I was, it was a crooked trail forward into someone new. I started writing in a small notebook, nothing fancy, just snapshots of the creek at dawn or the way the mule's breath steamed in the cold air. The words didn't flow easy, but they poured out low and steady, like a creek over stones, carrying my memories along without letting me drown in them. The emptiness inside me didn't vanish. It became a quiet room where I could sit and reflect rather than tremble with fear. I learned to trust small gestures, Mr. Carter's nod across the fence, the pastor's gentle good morning, the warmth of a bowl of soup after a day in the cold. And though the laughter of children in the distance sometimes stung with a reminder of what I'd lost, I let it remind me that joy still existed. I wasn't that scared boy anymore. I was a survivor with a heart tempered by heartbreak and hope in the same beat. The world had changed me, yes, tore away the cloak of innocence I wore as a child, but in its place I found resilience, a quiet strength that whispered, "You're still here." Sometimes, when the wind lifts just right and rustles the pines, I close my eyes and remember that boy, and I tell him softly, "You made it." Sometimes, hope arrives on quiet feet, like the soft tap of a sparrow at the window when you've almost forgotten the taste of song. It happened to me one spring morning when I was helping Mr. Carter mend a broken fence post by the creek. The dawn light was cool and the mist hung low among the pines, clinging to my coat like a timid friend. I'd been hauling posts back and forth all week, my muscles sore from the work, my mind still haunted by the echo of that barn door slamming behind me. But on that morning, as I sunk the post into the soft earth and tightened the wire, I heard a small voice call out, "Mister, could you help me?" I looked up to see little Tommy Jenkins, the preacher's grandson, standing by the water's edge with a battered fishing rod in his hand and eyes full of worry. He'd lost the hook in the creek when his bobber drifted too far, and he was fretting over the one chance he had to catch supper for his ma. I paused, feeling the ache in my back soften for the first time in months, and I smiled down at him. "Well now," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans, "let me see what we can do." Together, we waded into the cool water, me guiding him through each step, showing him how to tie a new hook with a slip knot that held fast but came undone when you needed it to. When his baited line bobbed true again, his face lit up brighter than the morning sun breaking through the clouds. I felt something stir in my chest, a gentle warmth, like the first sip of hot tea after a long winter. That moment changed everything. As Tommy reeled in his catch, I remembered the boy I used to be, the one who believed kindness was the truest currency. I realized I'd spent so long running from my past that I'd forgotten how to get back to the world that had given me a second chance. After we landed a good-sized base, Tommy offered me half for dinner. I shook my head, tucking the fish back into his creel. "You keep it, son. You earned it." And in his shy thanks, I heard a promise to myself that I'd start living again, not just surviving. The next week, I took on a small job rewiring Ms. Powell's porch light, something I'd avoided since leaving the shelter, afraid of heights and failure. But as I climbed the ladder with my tools strapped around my waist, I thought of Tommy's smile and how brave he'd been in that creek. I fixed the wiring, tightened every bolt, and tested the bulb until it shone steady and bright. When Ms. Powell flipped the switch and the porch glowed, she clasped her hands to her chest and said, "Lord, thank you." I took my hat and felt a steady beat of pride that chased away the hollow in my chest. It wasn't grand or glorious work, just a simple porch light, but it reminded me that I had something valuable to offer, a skill earned through sweat and perseverance. Over the following weeks, I started jotting down small goals in my notebook: fix the church's broken pew, help Mr. Jenkins haul hay, start saving up for a proper toolbox. Each entry felt like a declaration: I am here. I matter. In those quiet pages, I found a new purpose unfolding, one built on small acts of service, the kind that stitch communities back together when life threatens to unravel them. And with each task completed, I felt myself stretch a little toward the man I once dreamed of becoming, someone whose hands brought light, whose voice offered comfort, whose heart could trust again. Some nights, I'd clondle behind the church and sit on the crest, watching the valley glow with lanterns and porch lights, and I'd whisper a thanks to the dark memories that drove me here, to this new dawn of cautious optimism. Because sometimes the greatest second chance isn't a grand turning point, but a series of gentle nudges, like helping a boy retrieve his hook or tightening a wire until the light shines true. And in those moments, I learned that hope isn't a thunderbolt from the sky. It's a soft tap on the shoulder, reminding you it's never too late to begin again. I remember the morning I woke up with the sun slanting through the kitchen window and a quiet certainty pressing in my chest like the first breath of spring after a long winter. I'd spent years carrying that rusty chain in my pocket, a stubborn reminder that my past had power over me, whispering fear in my ear, convincing me that I was bound to the boy who trembled in that barn. But on that day, as I poured my coffee into an enamel mug and set it on the windowsill to catch the light, I felt something shift inside. I realized I'd been living in two worlds at once, one of memory and pain, and one of action and choice. My hand shook, not with fear, but with the tremor of knowing that I held the final word. I fetched the little wooden box where I'd tucked that piece of chain all those years ago and set it on the table. The edges were sharp, still stained with the grit of that barn's dust. I stared at it a long moment, feeling every scar on my soul reflected in those cold links. And then, with hands as steady as I could muster, I lifted the box out onto the front porch, the morning breeze catching the lid and rattling it like distant thunder. Neighbors passing by tipped their hats, curious at the weight in my eyes. I didn't say a word. I simply unscrewed the lid, tipped the chain into my palm, and felt the metal bite gently into my skin. For an instant, I expected memory to surge, panic, trembling, the taste of that long-ago rainwater, but nothing came. Instead, I raised my hand and let the chain slip through my fingers, clattering onto the wooden boards below. It fell with a soft echo, like the final toll of a bell, and I watched it rest there, inert, powerless. In that moment, I chose to step out of the shadow that had held me prisoner for more than half a century. I chose to honor the boy I once was by refusing to carry his chains into the rest of my days. Drafting breath, I closed my palm and turned toward the sunrise, feeling the heat on my face, tasting the sweetness of fresh air untainted by fear. I knew then that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what my father did, or pretending it never happened. It was about releasing myself from the endless loop of hurt and defining my own dignity. I whispered a simple truth to the morning sky: I choose to live. That decision rippled through my life like a stone dropped in still water. I found myself opening doors I'd kept shut, offering words I'd kept inside. I wrote letters at last to my sister, telling her I carried her silence in my heart, to my mother, apologizing for the blame I'd borne, even to the pastor who wrapped me in kindness, thanking him for guiding me back to my own soul. And with each letter sent, I felt a layer of guilt and sorrow peel away, revealing a man renewed. I sold the old farm tractor that Pa once used to drive me into fear, using the money to refurbish the community hall where kids could learn skills and share meals. I built a small bench by the creek, carving my initials alongside my brother's, a symbol that blood need not bind us in bitterness. On Sundays, I'd climb the hill behind the chapel and sit on that bench, listening to the wind play through the reeds and feeling alive in a way I never had before. Life wasn't without its quiet pangs. Sometimes the memory of that barn would echo in my dreams, and I'd wake with the tightness in my chest. But now, I met that echo with compassion, like greeting an old friend I'd once feared. I'd say softly to myself, "You're here, but you no longer define me." And the ache would ease, replaced by the warmth of victory, freedom. I kept that box that once held a chain, but now it housed mementos of my new life, a photograph of my grandchildren splashing in the creek, a handkerchief my wife embroidered with daisies, a ribbon from the community fair. Whenever doubt crept in, I'd open the box and touch those tokens, a testament to the power of choice. Because I had decided that my story would not end in a barn, or in chains, or in bitterness. It would end, as I spoke it now, standing tall in the morning light, a man who learned that while the past shapes you, it does not have to own you. I chose to live, and in doing so, I found the freedom I'd long sought, not in forgetting, but in finally letting go. I've carried that boy inside me all these years, and in the quiet of my 60s I see more clearly than ever what those dark days taught me. Back then, I believed kindness was simple, a soft word, a gentle touch. But life showed me that kindness can run deeper than that, like an underground spring feeding the world even when the surface is parched. I learned that the strongest hearts are not those that never break, but those that mend the cracks with something purer than before. When I was 10, I thought freedom meant running away. It wasn't until I was 60 that I understood real freedom shows up when you stop fleeing your own story and start owning it. I realized that carrying scars isn't the same as carrying a burden. Scars are testament to survival, to the moments you refuse to stay down no matter how hard the ground bit into your palms. I learned that memory is not a prison, but a library, each painful chapter a volume that, when opened, offers a lesson for someone searching by lamplight. And so, I gathered those volumes, the taste of rainwater in the barn, the echo of Pa's boots on straw, the ache in my sister's silent eyes, the warm quilt on that first night of refuge. I kept them not to punish myself, but to remind me how far I've come. I learned that forgiveness is not a gift for the one who hurt you, but a blessing you grant yourself. When I laid that chain down on my porch and walked into the dawn, I didn't free my father, I freed my own heart. That single act taught me that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it changes your relationship to it. I understood that love isn't a sentiment you empty into a cup, it's the cup itself. It holds all your fraction pieces and lets them shimmer together in something sturdier than bitterness. I learned to measure success not by how little pain I felt, but by how much compassion I carried for everyone, especially the parts of me that hurt the most. What I hope you'll take from my story is this: sometimes the chains that bind us are made of memory and fear, and the key to our own prison lies right where we left it, inside our fists. You don't have to wait for someone else to turn the lock. You carry the key, forged in the furnace of your own courage. Maybe you've been waiting for an apology that never comes, for a dawn that seems too distant, for a heart that mends itself without your help. Let me tell you this: dawn is always closer than you think, but it only breaks when you decide to let go of the night. You don't need a grand gesture. The first flicker of hope might come in the form of a small act, reaching out to say you're sorry, offering a smile to a stranger weighted by their own past, or simply deciding that today you will not carry the old burden. That moment of choice is the world's quiet revolution. It's the truth I've lived. Healing doesn't demand perfection, it asks only for persistence. It doesn't deny the darkness, it invites a single candle to stand against it. And in that single point of light, you'll find the strength to keep going. So if you're listening to my voice, carrying your own silent scars, know this: you are not defined by what happened to you, but by what you choose to do with those memories. Let them become the foundation beneath your feet instead of the stones on your chest. Choose to live, choose to forgive, choose to light a candle in your own night. Because the greatest lesson I've learned, one I hope you carry with you, is that sometimes the bravest act of all is not escaping your past, but standing in its shadow and saying, I am ready for the dawn. And now, here we are, you and me, on this porch of memories, watching the sun dip behind these Appalachian ridges as night gathers its velvet cloak. I've told you about the barn and the chain, about the boy I was and the man I became, and perhaps you're wondering what all of it means for today. Well, I'll tell you this much. Our past is never really past. It's a gentle whisper in the breeze, a shadow at the edge of a lamplight, reminding us who we were so we can choose who we will be. Tonight, as I sit with my enamel mug of chamomile cooling in my hands, I find my thoughts drifting to the ones I loved and lost along the way. My mama's forgiving lullabies, my sister's silent tears, the pastor's quilt that wrapped me in hope. I feel their presence in the hush of crickets and the soft click of the old clock on the mantel, almost as if they're leaning closer to hear what I'll say next. And I want to ask you, friend, as plainly as I would ask a neighbor over the fence, what do you believe about true love? Do you think it always comes back to find us, like a faithful hound circling its master? Or have you learned that sometimes love, once gone, plants its roots deep in another season and never returns the same? I'm not talking about the kind of love that sparkles and fades like fireworks in August. I mean the quiet, steadfast love, the kind that held me together when the barn was closing in, the kind that laid every stone of my new life. Does that kind of love circle back around the bend of our years and settle gently on our shoulders once more? Sometimes I swear it does. Sometimes, when the wind lifts just right and carries the scent of honeysuckle through these pines, I imagine my sister pausing at our old garden gate, her voice soft as a prayer. Sometimes I think she still remembers how it felt to chase fireflies at dusk, hand in hand, believing in tomorrow. And maybe that's true in your story too, that a love you thought lost forever is only sleeping, waiting for the right moment to awaken in your heart again. But maybe true love isn't about coming back. Maybe it's about carrying that spark wherever we go, letting it light our days and warm our nights, even if the ones we loved most have long since gone their separate ways. That, my friend, is the question I leave with you tonight. As the last embers of daylight fade, I hope you'll take a quiet moment to listen. Listen to the memory that stirs in your chest. Listen to the echo of what you once held dear, and listen for the gentle murmur of what you still believe. Because I've learned that our stories are never finished. They're a patchwork quilt of laughter and sorrow, of chains broken and freedom found, stitched together by choices we make each dawn. So tell me, what do you think? Does true love always find its way back to us? Or is its greatest gift the strength it gives us to keep walking forward, no matter where the path may lead? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments, because your story matters just as much as mine. And who knows, sometimes, in sharing these questions, we might just discover that the answers were inside us all along. Sometimes I think she still remembers, and sometimes I hope you do too.